The gun was already drawn when Esther Keating walked into the Red Mesa trading post, and the man holding it was pointing it directly at Milton Hayes. She had not planned to stop. She never planned to stop at Milton's place, not formally, not with any intention beyond the habit that had formed over 6 weeks of riding the same stretch of red dust road between her sister's homestead and the town of Calhoun Creek. But the sound of raised voices carried through the dry October air of 1882 like a rifle crack, and Esther's chestnut mare, Buttercup, had sidled to a halt of her own accord, ears flattened, nostrils wide. The man with the gun was named Clarence Dodd. Esther did not know that yet. She would learn it later, piecing together the whole ugly story the way you piece together a shattered ceramic jug, knowing the shape of the thing before you understand how badly it is broken. What she knew in that precise and terrifying moment was that Milton Hayes, who had mended her bridle strap 3 weeks ago without charging her a single cent, who had once handed her a tin cup of coffee through his open window as she passed, and then looked away as if embarrassed by his own generosity, who had never once in all her weeks of riding past said a word to her that was not kind, was standing with his hands raised level with his shoulders and a look on his face that was not fear exactly, but something harder and more dangerous than fear, something like controlled fury. "You signed the deed over," Clarence Dodd was saying, and his voice had the particular rasp of a man who believed himself to be righteous, "or I will make sure this whole county knows what you did in Abilene." The word Abilene landed in the room like a thrown stone landing in still water. Esther watched Milton's jaw tighten. She watched something shift in his expression, something private and painful get locked away behind a wall that went up so fast she almost missed it going up at all. She did not know what had happened in Abilene. She did not know that the secret Clarence Dodd was using as a weapon was one that Milton Hayes had spent 3 years running from, carrying it like a stone in his chest, letting it slowly crush the breath out of any life he tried to build. She did not know that the Red Mesa trading post, the 400 acres of scrubby New Mexico territory land it sat on, the water rights to the creek that ran behind it, represented every single thing Milton had managed to build in those 3 years, every single reason he had found to keep going after the night in Abilene that had nearly finished him. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew was that a man she had quietly come to think of as the most decent person on this stretch of road was being threatened, and that she had a Winchester rifle in the scabbard on her saddle, and that she had grown up in the New Mexico territory and was a considerably better shot than anyone who looked at her tended to assume. She walked through the door. "I am sorry to interrupt," Esther said, her voice steady in a way that surprised her, because her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. "But I am here for the bag of flour I ordered last week." Clarence Dodd turned. He was a heavy man, somewhere in his late 40s, with a face like a fist and small eyes that moved quickly over her in a way that was calculating rather than interested. His gun tracked toward her for just a moment before swinging back to Milton. "This is a private matter," Dodd said. "I can see that," Esther replied. She had moved without being fully conscious of it to a position where she was standing between Dodd and the front door, and where she had a clear line of sight to both of them. "But I have a rifle and you have a pistol, and I am standing a good deal further back than you are, which means the mathematics of this situation do not favor you as much as you seem to think they do." Clarence Dodd stared at her for a long moment. She could see him doing the calculation. She could see the moment he decided she was bluffing. "Woman," he said, in a tone that women on the frontier heard with considerable frequency from men who had underestimated the frontier itself, "you need to step outside." Esther Keating looked at Milton Hayes. Milton Hayes looked back at her, and in the split second of that exchange, something passed between them that she would spend a great deal of time afterward trying to find the right word for. It was not a request. It was not gratitude. It was something closer to recognition, the particular and startling feeling of being seen clearly by someone you have only ever been half looking at. "I will not be doing that," Esther said. That was how the most important day of her life began, in the middle of someone else's crisis, with a gun in the room and a secret in the air, and a man who had not yet told her that he had been watching her ride past for 6 weeks and counting the days between each sighting. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, and why the moment mattered the way it did, you have to go back to the beginning of those 6 weeks. To the first morning Esther Keating had ridden the road past the Red Mesa trading post, and the first morning Milton Hayes had looked up from his work and seen her. She had come to the New Mexico territory in August of 1882, not as a settler exactly, and not as a visitor exactly, but as something between the two. Her younger sister, Clara, had married a rancher named Thomas Birch the previous spring, and Clara had written in her 4th letter in 6 months that she was lonely in a way she had not anticipated, that the territory was vast and the distances were real, and she had not quite understood what she was agreeing to. The letters had been cheerful enough on the surface, but Esther had read between the lines of them the way only an older sister can read, and she had sold the seamstress shop she had been running in Santa Fe and packed her things and come. That had required explanation in Santa Fe, because Esther Keating at 26 was not precisely the sort of woman who did things without people noticing. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that the illustrated papers like to describe frontier heroines, soft and yielding and grateful for rescue. She was tall, with dark auburn hair that resisted all attempts to keep it tamed, and brown eyes that were steady in a way some people found comforting and others found unsettling depending on what they had to hide. She had an economy of movement and an economy of speech that she had developed early, in a childhood spent largely watching rather than performing, and she had a laugh that surprised people who had not heard it before, warm and sudden and very real. She had not been planning to stay in Calhoun Creek indefinitely. She had planned to spend 3 months with Clara and Thomas to help Clara find her footing, to learn the rhythms of the territory well enough that she could stop worrying from a distance, and then to return to Santa Fe and consider what to do next. She had money enough for that. She had a plan. The plan had not included the Red Mesa trading post or the man who ran it. The first morning she rode past, she almost did not see him. He was around the side of the building, working at something with a hammer and what looked like a great deal of concentration, and she was on the road proper, which ran perhaps 40 yards from where he was working. The movement of her passing drew his eye. She registered this only dimly, because she was thinking about Clara and about the particular quality of the silence she had ridden through for the past hour, the wide red rock silence of this part of the territory that she was still adjusting to after years in the relative noise of Santa Fe. Then something made her look back. She was not entirely sure what. A sound, perhaps, or simply the instinct that forms in you when you live in a place where knowing where other people are is a practical survival skill. She looked back and saw him standing still, hammer at his side, watching her go. She did not wave. She did not know why she did not wave. She thought about it for the next mile and could not arrive at a satisfactory answer. Milton Hayes had come to New Mexico territory from Kansas, and before Kansas, from Abilene, and before Abilene, from a childhood in Missouri that he thought of rarely and fondly, before everything that came after made that kind of easy fondness feel like a luxury he could not afford. He was 32 years old in the autumn of 1882, with dark hair going early to gray at the temples, and hands that were permanently rough from 3 years of building something out of nearly nothing. He had arrived in Calhoun Creek with $47, a horse, a basic inventory of goods purchased on credit from a supplier in Albuquerque, and a conviction that if he could just get far enough from Abilene, the person he had been there would eventually stop following him. He had been wrong about that last part. The person you have been follows you regardless of the distance, which is something Milton had been slowly learning in the quiet of the New Mexico territory, in the long evenings when there was no sound but the creek and the wind, and whatever it was he was running from that would not keep quiet. The trading post had been a good idea practically. The road between Calhoun Creek and the ranches to the north saw enough traffic to support a modest supply stop, and Milton had a talent for acquiring goods at the right price and a memory for what people needed before they always knew they needed it. He kept the place clean and well stocked, and he did not overcharge, and he did not ask questions. He had built a reputation in 18 months for being reliable and straight-dealing, and in the New Mexico territory in 1882 that was worth a great deal. He had not expected to be happy there. He had not been planning on happiness exactly. He had been planning on something quieter and more sustainable than happiness, something like the absence of the worst kind of pain, which after Abilene had seemed like an entirely reasonable life goal. And then Esther Keating had ridden past for the first time, and something in him that he had thought was entirely closed had cracked open slightly, against his will and without his permission, the way spring comes to a landscape that has been frozen and refuses to be refused. He had watched her ride past that first morning, and then he had stood there with his hammer at his side long after she was gone, listening to the sound of her horse's hooves fade into the distance, wondering who she was and where she was going and whether she would come back this way. She had come back the next morning, and the morning after that. By the third week, he knew the approximate time she would pass. By the fourth week, he had developed a habit he was not proud of and could not seem to stop, of making sure he was working somewhere visible in the hour or so when she would come by. He told himself this was coincidence. He told himself a lot of things. She began to slow. Not significantly, not dramatically, but in the way a person slows when they are no longer quite so certain about where they are going or how urgently they need to get there. She would pass, and then several days later she would pass again, and the pace would be marginally slower. And once she had turned her head in his direction, and he had been looking right at her, and they had made eye contact for a full 2 or 3 seconds before she had moved on. He thought about those 2 or 3 seconds for approximately the following 72 hours. It was the 5th week when she stopped. She had needed a new bridle strap, or so she said, and her saddle bag had needed checking, and she had supplies to order, all of which were perfectly legitimate reasons for stopping at a trading post. She had walked in with the confident, unhurried manner of a woman who knew exactly where she was and why she was there, and expected to be treated accordingly. He had been behind the counter, and he had greeted her, and she had greeted him, and they had conducted the business of the bridle strap and the supplies with perfect professional efficiency. And then, when the transaction was complete and there was no further practical reason to stay, she had remained standing at his counter, and he had remained standing on his side of it, and neither of them had said a word for a moment that stretched out long enough to become something. He had been the one to break it. He had asked where she was headed, and she had told him about Clara and Thomas and the ranch, and he had nodded, and she had asked how long he had been running the post, and he had told her 3 years, and she had said it seemed like a good place, and he had said he had found it to be so. It was the most ordinary conversation in the world, and he had replayed it afterward with the focused attention of a man who has very little else to replay. The coffee had happened the following week. He had been in the middle of a morning's worth of inventory when he heard Buttercup's distinctive 4-beat walk on the road, and without thinking he had made a second cup and then stood at his window watching her pass, and when she glanced over, as she always glanced over now, always, he had held the cup out through the window. She had stopped. She had looked at the cup. She had looked at him. For me, she had said. Seemed like a long ride, he had said. She had taken the cup. She had drunk it there in the road, Buttercup standing patient in the morning sun, and then she had handed the cup back through the window and said, "Good coffee," in a tone that was so carefully neutral it was almost funny, and then she had ridden on. He had held the cup for several minutes after she left, turning it in his hands, feeling something warm in his chest that he could not decide what to do with. It was the 6th week when Clarence Dodd had arrived. Esther did not know about Clarence Dodd, yet when she handed Milton's cup back through the window. She did not know that Dodd had been looking for Milton Hayes for nearly a year, moving from Kansas through Texas and into the New Mexico territory with the patient certainty of a man who believes he has all the time in the world because he holds all the cards. She did not know that the thing Dodd knew about Abilene was the same thing that had sent Milton running 3 years ago, the same thing that had driven him to this particular stretch of red road and this particular attempt at a different kind of life. Dodd showed up at the trading post on a Tuesday, 3 days before the incident with the gun. He had been pleasant enough on that first visit, buying a small amount of dry goods and asking the sort of casual questions that might have been friendly but that Milton recognized immediately as reconnaissance. He had answered them carefully, giving nothing away, watching Dodd's small sharp eyes move around the room and register everything. After Dodd left, Milton had stood very still in the middle of his own store for a long time, feeling the 3-year-old ice in his chest come back. Abilene. The word sat in him like a splinter. He had been a different person in Abilene. Not in the way that people say that to excuse themselves, the way a man says he was young and foolish and has changed now, because he means only that he has gotten better at not getting caught. Milton meant it differently and more painfully than that. He had been a deputy in Abilene, working under a marshal named Greer, and the town had been a hard and violent place in the way that cattle towns were hard and violent in the late 1870s. He had tried to do his job honestly, and he had believed for a time that Greer was an honest man too. The night that ended everything, Greer had shot a man named James Whitfield, a black farmer who had come to town to dispute a land claim and had been shot in the back outside the marshal's office, and the killing had been ruled a justified response to an alleged threat. Milton had been there. He had seen what happened. He had seen that Whitfield was not threatening anyone and had not been threatening anyone. He had been given very clear instructions about what he had seen, and he had initially complied with those instructions because he was 29 years old and frightened and working in a system that offered very little protection to men who chose to tell the truth. He had told the truth anyway. 6 months later, after the case had been quietly buried and Greer had been reassigned rather than prosecuted, Milton had written out everything he knew and sent it to the county seat and then ridden away from Abilene before anyone could make him unwrite it. The evidence had not been enough. The system had protected itself, as systems do. But Milton had at least done what he had not done immediately, what had haunted him in the 6 months between the killing and the letter, and that carried its own weight. What Clarence Dodd had on him was the 6 months. The 6-month gap when Milton Hayes had said nothing, when he had been complicit by silence, when James Whitfield's family had been grieving without anyone standing up. Dodd was a lawyer of the worst kind, a man who had made a career of knowing where the bodies were buried, and he had acquired that particular piece of Milton's buried history and turned it into a tool. The implication was straightforward enough. Sign over the water rights to the creek and the land around it, and Dodd would take his information elsewhere. Refuse, and every person in Calhoun Creek would know that Milton Hayes had been silent when a man was murdered. Dodd had returned on a Thursday with the gun and the deed and the absolute certainty that he had Milton cornered. He had not accounted for Esther Keating and her Winchester. She had walked in on a Thursday morning that had looked from the road like any other Thursday morning and found the corner Dodd had built. "I will not be doing that," she said, and stood her ground, and Clarence Dodd looked from her to Milton and back again, and the calculation in his face shifted slightly. "You do not know what you are getting involved in," Dodd said. "I have the general outline," Esther replied. Her voice was still very steady. She was acutely aware of Milton across the room, aware that he had lowered his hand slightly, aware that something in his expression had shifted again when she came in, something she did not have a name for yet but would eventually recognize as the precise moment a person's defenses begin to come down. "Step outside with me," Dodd said to her, in a tone that suggested he intended to explain things to her that she was too simple to understand without explanation. "No," Esther said. Dodd took a step toward her. Milton moved at the same time, not for a weapon, not for Dodd, but placing himself between them with a speed that surprised her given how still he had been standing. He was close to her now, closer than they had ever been, and she could see the set of his jaw and the controlled anger in his face and the other thing underneath it that she had no name for yet. "Dodd," Milton said, and his voice was very quiet. "Whatever you think you know about me, she is not part of it. Leave her out of it." "She walked into it," Dodd said reasonably. "I walked into it on purpose," Esther said from behind Milton's shoulder. There was a brief silence in which Dodd seemed to be genuinely reconsidering the situation. Esther used that silence to take one further step back, placing her hand on the handle of the trading post door, pushing it open behind her with one smooth motion. The sound of the wind outside entered the room. The light changed. "You should leave," Esther said to Dodd. "You should get back on your horse and ride toward Calhoun Creek and consider very carefully whether this particular piece of business is worth the kind of trouble that tends to follow men who pull guns in this territory. Because I will tell you from personal experience that the community memory in a small county is very long and very accurate, and there is not a single person between here and the northern ranches who does not know Milton Hayes and think well of him, which is a kind of protection you cannot buy or steal." Dodd stared at her. She looked back at him with the level brown eyes that some people found unsettling. He put the gun away. He picked up the deed from the counter where he had laid it. He walked past her and through the door, and the sound of his horse eventually faded to the south. In the silence that followed, Esther became aware that her knees were not entirely steady, and that her heart was still hammering with a force that was probably visible, and that she and Milton Hayes were alone in his store for the first time, with no counter between them and no transaction to organize the space. She turned to face him. He was looking at her in a way that made it difficult to think clearly. "I did not have an order for flour," she said. "I know," he said. "Are you all right?" He let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time. "I do not know yet," he said honestly, and then, "You should not have done that." "No," she agreed, "probably not. He will come back." "Yes," she said. "I imagine he will, which is why you should probably tell me what he knows about Abilene." She watched him go still in the way that people go still when they have been hit somewhere they did not expect to be hit. She watched the controlled expression hold for a moment, and then slowly, not collapse exactly, but yield slightly around the edges. He pulled out the chair from behind the counter and sat down in it, and she pulled a wooden stool from its position beside the stove and sat down on it, and he told her about Abilene. It took a long time. She did not interrupt. She listened the way she had always listened, with her full attention and without rushing him, and when he got to the part about James Whitfield she could feel the weight of it, the real weight of the thing he carried, which was not guilt over what he had done but guilt over the months he had spent doing nothing, the months in which a family had been without justice and he had known and said nothing. "You told the truth eventually," she said. "Not soon enough," he said. "You were one person in a system that was built to punish people for telling the truth," she said. "That is not a sufficient excuse." "No," she said, "it is not, but it is a reason. Those are different things." He looked at her then with an expression she could not fully read, something complex and careful and searching. "Why are you defending me?" "I am not defending you," she said. "I am telling you what I see. What you choose to do with it is your own matter." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the dried grass in the particular low sound that the New Mexico Territory wind made in October, like something breathing slowly. "He will use it," Milton said. "Whether or not it is legally actionable, he will use it in town, tell people, and not the full version, not the part where I eventually wrote the letter, just the months of silence." "Yes," Esther said. "He probably will." And you are not concerned about having been seen here when he does. She thought about that for a moment. I'm not greatly concerned about what Clarence Dodd chooses to say about me, she said. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it, the slight upward movement at the corner of his mouth that she had been cataloging without intending to for 6 weeks, and it did something to the already unsteady quality of her breathing. She left half an hour later, because she had told Clara she would be back by midday and Clara would worry. She rode the road south thinking about Milton Hayes and Abilene and the particular expression on his face when she had held Dodd's attention at gunpoint, and she could not sort out the shape of what she was feeling into any category she had words for. In the week that followed, she rode past every day. He came to the window on the second day, not with coffee, but simply standing there, and she slowed to walking pace and they looked at each other, and she raised her hand in greeting and he raised his in return, and that was all, but it sat in her chest for the rest of the ride like something warm. On the fourth day, Dodd had indeed been talking. Thomas came in from town with the information, delivered over the supper table with the careful manner of a man who is not sure how the person he is telling is going to receive it. He said that a fellow named Dodd had been in Calhoun Creek telling a story about the man at the trading post up the North Road, about something that had happened in Kansas a few years back, about a killing that had been hushed up. He watched Esther's face while he said it. I know about Abilene, Esther said. Clara and Thomas exchanged a look across the table. Milton Hayes told you, Thomas said. He told me, Esther said, and it is more complicated than Dodd is making it sound, Esther said. As these things usually are. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He was a good man, Thomas Birch, solid and deliberate in the way that men who had built things from nothing tended to be solid and deliberate. He had known Milton Hayes by reputation for the year and a half the trading post had been operating. He had used it, had found Milton straight-dealing and fair. He considered what Esther had said. Do you want me to go speak to some people in town? He asked. Esther looked at him. Clara, across the table, was watching her with the focused attention of a younger sister who has been reading Esther's face her entire life and knows exactly what she is seeing. I will do it myself, Esther said. She went to Calhoun Creek the next morning, which was a Saturday, which meant it was a market day, and the town was populated with the full range of people who used it as their supply point. She did not go looking for Dodd, though she would not have been afraid to find him. She went looking for the people who mattered in the county, the people whose opinions had weight, and she told them what she knew about Abilene. All of it. The killing, the cover-up, the 6 months of silence, and the letter that Milton Hayes had eventually written in full knowledge that it would end his life in Abilene and possibly make it dangerous. She did not ask anyone to think well of him. She simply gave them the complete story rather than the incomplete one. By the time she rode back north, she had spoken to the minister, the storekeeper, 3 ranchers, 2 wives of ranchers, and the postmaster. The county did not exactly have a governing body beyond the county seat, but it had a social fabric, and she had threaded the truth through it as carefully as she knew how. She did not tell Milton what she had done. Not that day. She rode past the trading post on her way back and saw him working at the front, and she slowed and he looked up and she said, Dodd has been talking in town. I know, he said. People will make their own judgments. He studied her face. Something shifted in his expression. You went into town, he said, and it was not a question. I needed some things, she said. Esther, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it land with a peculiar precision. What did you do? I told the truth, she said. Which is what you did when it mattered. It seemed like reasonable precedent. He stood looking at her for a moment with an expression that was becoming familiar to her in the way that expressions become familiar when you have been paying careful attention to someone's face, which she had been doing. She admitted to herself now fully, for some time. Come inside for a moment, he said. She tied Buttercup to the post and went inside. He poured 2 cups of coffee and they stood at his counter and he said, You did not have to do that. I know, she said. You put yourself in Dodd's line of sight. He is not what I consider a serious threat, she said. He is a bully with some useful information and no particular courage. The gun on Thursday was a bluff and we both knew it. You knew it, Milton said. I was not entirely certain. You were, she said. You just had more to lose, which made the calculus feel different. He was quiet. She drank her coffee. Why? He said finally. She thought about how to answer that honestly, and she settled on the version that was true without being everything. Because it was right to do, she said, and because you have been decent to me and decent to everyone on this road, and Dodd is neither of those things. He nodded slowly, as if accepting that answer while being aware it was not the complete one. She appreciated that he did not push. She left and rode home, and Clara met her at the door with a look that said she had been watching from the window and making her own observations, and Esther walked past her and said, "Do not," and Clara said, "I did not say anything," and Esther said, "You were about to," and they both knew she was right. The following Tuesday, Dodd returned. He did not come to the trading post this time. He found Milton on the road between the post and Calhoun Creek in the early morning while Milton was making a supply run. There was no gun this time. Instead, there was a document that Dodd claimed was a legal filing asserting that the water rights to the creek had originally belonged to a ranching operation that Dodd represented, and that they had never been legally transferred to the property Milton Hayes had purchased. It was, as legal threats go, more genuinely frightening than the gun had been, because a gun you can face down, and a legal document you cannot always shoot your way past. Milton brought it to Esther. He appeared at Clara and Thomas's ranch at mid-morning on a Tuesday, which surprised her, because he had never come to find her before. She had always been the one moving toward him. The shift was noticeable. Clara noticed it with the accuracy of a person whose entire romantic life had been spent watching Esther fail to let anyone get close, and she made herself very scarce after answering the door. Esther and Milton sat at the kitchen table with the document between them, and he explained what it said and what it implied. She read it carefully. She had grown up in a family with a lawyer father, which was not something she had mentioned to many people in the territory, because it tended to create expectations she did not always want to manage, but it meant she could read a legal document with some facility. "This is not a valid filing," she said. "Can you be certain?" "Reasonably." She pointed to two specific clauses. "These references are to a statute that was superseded in 1878. If the water rights were actually contested on the basis he is claiming, this would have had to have been filed before that date. The date on this is 1882. She looked up at him. "He made a mistake, or he assumed you would not know enough to spot it." Milton stared at the document. She watched something happen in his face, a complicated unwinding of tension that had clearly been building since before Tuesday, since before Thursday of the previous week, possibly for much longer than that. "How do you know that?" he said. "My father was a county attorney in Santa Fe," she said. "I grew up reading case files." He looked at her. There was something in the look that she recognized from the window on the morning of the coffee, from the counter when he had given back the repaired bridle strap, from every slow ride past this building over 6 weeks, and she recognized it now for what it was, had been avoiding recognizing it, and could not continue to avoid it in the direct light of his attention. "Esther," he said. His voice was different than usual, quieter. "More careful, the way you are careful with something you are afraid of dropping." "Milton," she said, and her voice came out more unsteady than she intended. "I need to say something," he said. "You do not have to," she said, which was not what she meant at all. "I want to," he said. "I have wanted to for some time." He paused, and she could see him choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who does not use words carelessly. "Before you started riding past, I had not been looking forward to anything. Not in a despairing way, I am not saying that. Just in the way of a man who has reduced his expectations to the manageable, the day ahead, the work at hand, nothing past that." Another pause. "And then you started riding past, and I started looking forward to it, just seeing you ride past." And I knew that was a small thing and a strange thing and probably not something I was meant to act on, but it was there, every morning. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the rough hands and the early gray at his temples and the face that she had been memorizing without meaning to for 6 weeks, and she said, "It was not only you." He let out a breath. "I slowed down," she said, "deliberately. Every time I got closer to your stretch of road, I slowed down." "I noticed," he said. "I thought you might." Clara moved somewhere in the back of the house with a sound that was slightly too deliberate to be accidental. Both of them became aware of it simultaneously, and both of them almost smiled. "The legal filing," Esther said, returning to the document on the table because she needed something practical to organize herself around. "You should take this to the county seat. Take it to the land registry office. They will have the original water rights documentation for the property and the filing date, and it will be clear that Dodd's claim is fraudulent." "That takes time," Milton said. 2 weeks at most," she said. "I can come with you if you need someone who knows what they are looking at." He studied her face for a moment. "Is that an offer?" "It is a practical suggestion," she said, and then, because she had decided in the last 30 seconds to stop being careful about this, "and also yes, it is an offer." The county seat was a town called Rojo Blanco, a 2-day ride south and east of Calhoun Creek. It was not the sort of journey a woman and a man undertook together in 1882 without commentary from their community, and both Esther and Milton were aware of that. Thomas raised one eyebrow when Esther told him. Clara raised both, and then covered a smile with her hand. Esther borrowed Thomas's spare horse for the journey, because Buttercup was a good horse but not ideal for 2 days of sustained riding. They set out on a Wednesday morning, early, before the October sun had cleared the mesa. The first hour was largely silent, both of them adjusting to the new reality of being in each other's company in motion, rather than in the stationary contained space of the trading post or the ranch kitchen. The road was good, the land was wide, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable but inhabited, the way silence is when both people in it are thinking. What was Santa Fe like? He asked when they had been riding for perhaps 2 hours. She told him. She told him about the city's layers, the old Spanish colonial parts and the newer American development pressing in from all sides, about the seamstress shop she had built herself from nothing at the age of 23, about the clients, about the work of it, which she had liked more than she had expected to like it, the precise problem-solving of fitting fabric to the particular requirements of a particular person. She told him about her father, the lawyer, and her mother, who had died of fever when Esther was 17, and about Clara, who had always been braver than people assumed, because they saw the gentle exterior and missed the iron underneath. He listened with the same quality of attention she gave to things that mattered, and that itself was something, because people who listened like that were not common. "Why did you leave?" he said. "I told you, Clara needed someone." "You told me the version you were comfortable with," he said, and the accuracy of it surprised her slightly. "Why did you actually leave?" she considered. The honest answer was more complex than the comfortable version. "I had been running the shop for 3 years," she said, "and it was a good business and I was good at it, and I realized one morning that those were the only 2 things I could say about it with any certainty. That it was good and that I was good at it. I could not say I was happy. I could not say I was headed anywhere. I was very competent and very alone, and Clara's letter gave me an excuse to do what I think I had been building toward for some time, which was to change something." "And did you?" he said. "Change something?" She looked at him, riding alongside her in the morning light with the red rock country opening up around them. "I am beginning to think so," she said. They reached a way station at midday where they ate and rested the horses, and in the afternoon the country changed, dropping from the mesa country into something more wooded and less dramatic, the scrub oaks coming in and the light going golden under them. They rode companionably, sometimes talking and sometimes not, and by late afternoon, when they made camp at a spot beside a small creek, Esther had the feeling that she had known him longer than 6 weeks, the particular feeling of ease that arrives when 2 people discover they are compatible in the deep-down ways that matter. He made the fire. She made the food, which was simple, hard biscuits from that morning and dried beans she had brought in a small pot, and they ate together in the firelight, and the conversation wound from his 3 years in the territory to her childhood in Santa Fe, to the question of what they each thought was worth doing with a life. And that conversation was the sort that happens rarely and only between people who are paying each other genuine attention. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked. It came out in a pause in the conversation, with the fire crackling between them and the coyotes starting up somewhere on the mesa above. She did not mean Rojo Blanco, which they had not reached yet. She meant the territory, the wide, empty, particular loneliness of a life built at the edge of the settled world. He looked at her across the fire for a long moment before he answered. "Not since you started riding past," he said. She felt the words land with a precision that was almost physical, in the chest, in the breath, in the skin. He said it simply, without decoration, the way he said most things, and that simplicity was what made it so completely undeniable. He meant it exactly as he had said it. She did not say anything for a moment. She was aware of her own breathing. "I ride past every day," she said, which was not the most articulate thing she had ever said but was the best she could manage. "I know," he said. "I count the hours." The fire snapped. The coyotes answered each other across the dark. Esther Keating sat in the firelight of the New Mexico Territory on a Wednesday night in October of 1882 and understood that she was in love with Milton Hayes, and that the understanding had been coming for 6 weeks and was now fully arrived, and that she was not afraid of it. "Milton," she said. "Esther," he said. She got up from her side of the fire and came around to his side and sat down beside him, and he did not move away, and they sat close together in the warmth of it for a long time without saying anything at all, and eventually his hand found hers in the space between them and held it, and she held it back. They slept on opposite sides of the fire because this was 1882, and they were both people with a sense of propriety and practical reputation to consider. But in the morning, when she woke to the sound of him already building up the fire again, she lay in her bedroll for a moment watching him move in the gray early light, and felt something so clear and uncomplicated that it surprised her, given how complex everything else seemed to be. Rojo Blanco was a town of moderate size and considerable bureaucratic dignity, which meant that its land registry office was housed in a proper stone building and staffed by a clerk named Alcott, who had the particular brand of professional meticulousness that Esther found enormously reassuring in a person handling legal documents. He looked at Dodd's filing. He looked at Milton's original water rights documentation. He looked at the dates. He produced a ledger. "This filing refers to the Consolidated Water Statutes of 1875, Alcott said, in the tone of a man explaining something obvious, which were superseded by the revised statutes of 1878. Any claim filed under the 1875 statutes after the revision is invalid on its face. This document," he held up Dodd's filing, "was filed this year. It has no legal standing." "Can you put that in writing?" Esther said. Alcott looked at her with the professional appraisal of a man who is deciding whether to be condescending. He looked at her father's name, which she had invoked as a reference in their introduction. He looked at the document. "I can issue a formal registry notation to that effect," he said. "That would be very helpful," Esther said. "Thank you." They had the notation by mid-afternoon and were on the road back by 3 o'clock. Milton folded the document and placed it in his coat pocket with a care that suggested he was treating it as the thing it was, which was the end of Clarence Dodd as a genuine threat. "You knew exactly what to ask for," he said, as they rode north. "I have watched my father work all my life," she said. "I owe you a significant debt," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "We are friends." He looked at her with an expression that said clearly that he thought friends was perhaps not the entirely accurate current term. "Are we?" he said. She felt her face warm in a way that she found mildly exasperating. "What would you prefer to call it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, riding with his eyes on the road ahead. "I would prefer to call it whatever it is honestly," he said, "which is something I am not practiced at because I have been careful for a long time. But what I said last night was honest. I am not lonely when you are near, and when you are not near I am aware of it. That is the honest version." She took a breath of the clear high desert air. "The honest version," she said, "is that I came to this territory with a plan to spend 3 months and go home, and I do not think about going home anymore." He looked at her quickly. "Because of Clara," he said carefully. "Among other reasons," she said. They rode in silence for a few minutes that felt like a considerable conversation. "Esther," he said. "Milton," she said. "I would like to be something more than friends," he said, with the directness of a man who has decided to stop being careful about something. "If that is a direction you would consider." She thought about careful, about the years she had spent being careful in Santa Fe with the shop and the competence and the being good at things and being alone. She thought about 6 weeks of slowing down on a road she did not have to slow down on. She thought about sitting beside a fire in the dark and holding a hand that held hers back. "I would consider it," she said. Very seriously. They returned to find that Calhoun Creek had, in the way of small communities, developed a collective opinion about Clarence Dodd in their absence. The opinion was not favorable. The Reverend Cole had spoken at Sunday service about the nature of true testimony and the difference between a person who eventually stands for truth and a person who deploys it selectively for profit. The storekeeper had refused Dodd's service. 3 ranchers had made it clear that they considered the trading post a community resource worth protecting. Dodd left the county on a Saturday. He did not communicate his departure or his destination to anyone, and no one made inquiries. Milton went to the ranch to tell Esther that Dodd was gone. He arrived in the late afternoon and found her in the side garden Clara had planted, pulling up the last of the autumn vegetables before the frost could get them. She was on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming down from its arrangement, and she looked up when she heard hoofbeats and then stood up and came to the fence. "Dodd is gone," he said. She let out a breath that was mostly relief. "Good," she said. "Notation from Rojo Blanco will be on record if he ever tries again," he said. "Good," she said again. "I also wanted to ask you something," he said from his horse, which put him at a slight height advantage that he seemed to be aware of because he dismounted and tied the horse to the fence post so they were level. "Yes," she said. "There is a social occasion in Calhoun Creek next Friday," he said. "A sort of harvest gathering that the minister organizes. I have never attended before." He paused. "I would like to attend with you if you would be willing." She was very aware of Clara in the kitchen window behind her and the quality of attentiveness coming from that direction. "A social occasion," she said. "A dance among other things," he said, with a slight self-consciousness that was very different from his usual steadiness and that she found entirely charming. "Do you dance?" she asked. "Not well," he said honestly. "That seems fair," she said. "I dance adequately. I can work with not well." She smiled. "Yes, Milton, I will go to the harvest gathering with you." He smiled back, and it was not the partial almost smile she had been cataloging. It was a full, proper smile, and it reached his eyes in a way that rearranged something in her chest. The harvest gathering in Calhoun Creek on the 3rd Friday of October 1882 was everything that small-town frontier social occasions were supposed to be, which meant it was crowded and noisy and full of fiddle music that was more enthusiastic than precise. And it was also warm and generous and alive in the way that communities are alive when they have built something together in a difficult country and want to celebrate it. Milton arrived at the ranch in a suit that had been brushed clean and a hat that was newer than his usual one. Esther had worn a dark green dress that was one she had sewn herself, in the years when sewing was her livelihood, and it fit her with the precision that you can only achieve when you are making something for your own exact measurements. Clara saw them standing together in the yard before they left, and had the expression of a person who wants very much to say something, and has made a binding agreement with herself not to. They drove to town in Milton's wagon. The road was familiar to her, the road she rode every day, the stretch past the trading post that had accumulated 6 weeks of significance. And tonight the way it ran between them in the dark felt different, full of something. "I have been thinking," Milton said as they drove, "about what happens next. Specifically," she said, "about whether you are truly planning to return to Santa Fe," he said. At some point, she looked at the road ahead of them. "I have been thinking about that too," she said. "I think the honest answer is that I do not know. I'm not looking toward leaving. I find myself not looking toward leaving." "I am glad to hear that," he said. "Not entirely selfishly. I think you are good for this county." "And less selflessly," she said. He kept his eyes on the road, but the line of his mouth curved. "Less selflessly, I am glad you will be here," he said. They danced 3 times, which in the social accounting of a frontier community in 1882 was a clear and public statement. He danced as he had promised, not well, but with concentration and with the self-deprecating willingness to be corrected when she guided his arm to a better position. And by the 3rd dance, he was considerably less terrible than he had been during the first one. She laughed during the 2nd dance when he lost the rhythm, and found it again by watching her feet. And the laugh surprised him into laughing too. And that was the moment that several people in the room observed and remembered later as the moment it became obvious. Thomas danced with Clara and watched Esther across the room with the satisfied expression of a man who has been hoping for something for some time and is seeing it come together. Clara pressed her face briefly into his shoulder, and he was fairly sure it was because she was smiling too widely and wanted to contain it. Reverend Cole shook Milton's hand at the end of the evening and said he was glad to see him at the social, and Milton said he intended to come to more of them. They drove home through the cold October dark, and the road was silver-white with moonlight, and when they reached the branch that went toward the ranch, Esther said, without looking at him, "You should stay for supper tomorrow, if you want to." A pause. "I would like that," he said. He handed her down from the wagon with a care that was slightly more deliberate than strictly necessary, and she let him, and his hand held hers a moment past the practical requirement, and they stood in the moonlight outside the ranch gate and looked at each other. "Thank you for this evening," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said. She stood on her toes and kissed him briefly and gently on the cheek. She felt him go very still. She stepped back and he was looking at her with an expression that she had never seen on him before, open and unguarded in a way that the controlled, careful face she had learned was not the whole of him. "Good night, Milton," she said. "Good night, Esther," he said. And she went through the gate and he drove away, and she stood in the yard listening to the wagon wheels on the gravel until they faded and the night was quiet. She went inside to find Clara sitting at the table with 2 cups of tea as if she had known. "Do not," Esther said. "You kissed him," Clara said. "On the cheek," Esther said. "I saw," Clara said. Esther sat down and took the cup of tea. "You were watching out the window," she said. "The kitchen window faces the yard," Clara said, entirely without apology. "Esther, tell me." Esther wrapped both hands around the cup and thought about how to say it. "He told me he has not been lonely since I started riding past," she said. "And I told him I do not think about going home anymore." She paused. "I think that is the whole of it, honestly." Clara looked at her sister with the eyes that had been reading Esther's face for her entire life. "You are in love with him," she said. "Yes," Esther said. She said it simply, the way she had decided to say true things, taking the direction from the man who was trying to learn the same practice. "I believe I am." Clara reached across the table and squeezed her hand. They drank their tea. Milton came to supper the next evening and many evenings after that. The ride between the trading post and the ranch became bidirectional, his horse on the road south in the evenings and her chestnut mare moving north in the mornings. They found a pattern of days that moved between work and shared time, with a naturalness that surprised them both, because neither of them had been people for whom intimacy had come easily or quickly, and this had arrived with a speed that they had not manufactured and could not entirely explain. He showed her the trading post properly, not the front counter where transactions happened but the back workrooms where he kept inventory. The small house attached behind the main building where he lived, spare and clean and full of books that she had not known about. She stood at his bookshelf for 10 minutes pulling things out and putting them back and asking him questions about each one, and he watched her do it with the focused pleasure of a person observing someone else discovering something they love. She brought him into her work too. She had begun, during her months in the territory, doing occasional sewing for women in Calhoun Creek, at first just as a service to neighbors and then more formally as word spread, and she had not been thinking of it as a return to the business she had run in Santa Fe. But when Milton asked her about it one evening, she described the work with an enthusiasm she recognized in herself as genuine. "You miss it," he said. "I miss the making of things," she said. "The problem-solving of it." "Could you do it here?" he said. "Build something like what you had in Santa Fe?" She had not fully allowed herself to think about that yet, about the future as something she was building here rather than visiting, and hearing him say it aloud opened something up. "I think I could," she said. "The trading post has more space than I use," he said carefully, in the tone of someone suggesting something that has more weight than the literal words. "If you wanted a workspace, I mean. There is a room on the south side with good light." She looked at him. He looked at her. They were at the kitchen table in his house behind the trading post, which was a place she had been coming increasingly often, and the lamplight was warm and the books were on the shelf behind him, and outside the creek made its small, quiet sound. "Are you suggesting a business arrangement?" she said. "I am suggesting whatever you would like it to be," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand, which was something she had begun to do as naturally as breathing, and he turned his palm up and held hers. "Milton," she said, "I need to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I am not going back to Santa Fe," she said. "I decided that some time ago." I was not entirely ready to say it out loud until now. He looked at her with the careful, quiet attention that she had come to love most about him. "I am glad," he said, in a voice that meant something larger than the two words. "And I would like the room on the south side," she said, "if that is a genuine offer." "It is a genuine offer," he said, "and everything that comes with it." She knew what he meant. She had known for several weeks what they were moving toward, not with the anxious awareness of someone approaching something frightening, but with the settled knowledge of someone approaching something true. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and came around to her side, and he crouched down beside her chair, and he took both of her hands in his, and he said, "Esther Keating, I have been watching you ride past for 6 weeks and falling in love with you for most of them. I would like to spend the rest of my life with you, if you will have me. I know I am not simple or without history, and I know this territory is hard and uncertain, but I believe we are stronger together than apart, and I believe we are honest with each other in a way that does not come often, and I am asking you to marry me." She was smiling before he finished. She could feel it on her face, the kind of smile that does not wait for permission. "Yes," she said. "Milton Hayes, yes." He stood and pulled her to her feet and held her, and she let herself be held in the way that she had not let anyone hold her in a long time, because she had been careful, because she had been sufficient to herself, because she had not understood until this particular man in this particular territory that sufficiency and love are not the same thing, and you can have both simultaneously if you are lucky enough. She was lucky enough. They were married in December of 1882 in Calhoun Creek, in the church where Reverend Cole preached and the harvest gathering danced, on a day that was cold and bright, the kind of clear, hard blue winter day that the New Mexico territory offered as compensation for the full severity of the season. Clara cried. Thomas shook Milton's hand with a firmness that was approval expressed through grip. A substantial number of people from the county attended, because the trading post had been feeding and supplying this community for 3 years and people knew Milton, and because Esther Keating had in 4 months become the person who had given them the full truth about Abilene and danced badly, but happily at the harvest gathering, and made herself useful in the quiet, practical way that communities run on. Esther wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with a trim she had done in the long evenings of November, while Clara sat across from her doing her own mending, and occasionally looking up with an expression that combined happiness and nostalgia in a ratio that made Esther feel tender toward her. Milton wore the suit he had worn to the harvest gathering, and had it pressed properly this time, and stood at the front of the church with his hands clasped in front of him in an attitude that looked composed, but that Esther, who now knew his face, could see was not composed at all. When she walked in on Thomas's arm, Milton looked at her, and the composure entirely left him, and what was underneath it was so clear and open that the woman in the third pew on the left actually pressed her hand to her heart. Reverend Cole read from the scriptures and performed the ceremony with a gravity that was appropriate to the occasion, and with one small deviation when he departed from the formal text to say, in his own words, that he had rarely seen two people more obviously suited to each other in his years of ministry, which caused a quiet ripple of warmth through the assembled people, and made Milton look briefly at his boots, and Esther press her lips together against a smile. They said their vows. Milton's voice was steady when he got to the part about the rest of their lives. Esther's was steady throughout because she had practiced, and because she meant it completely, and meaning something completely tends to make the saying of it easier. They were married. She moved into the house behind the trading post and brought her belongings, which were not extensive but were carefully chosen. The good books and the sewing tools and a quilt her mother had made that she had carried from Santa Fe with more care than almost anything else. She put the quilt on the bed that was now their bed, and she put her books next to his on the shelf, and she looked at the room where their things lived together and felt something settle in her. The room on the south side became her workroom in January. She set up her sewing table beside the window that caught the morning light and the afternoon light both, and she put out word in the county that she was available for commissioned work, and within 2 weeks she had more orders than she had anticipated. By February she had hired a girl from town to help her, a 17-year-old named Rosa Alcado, who had grown up watching her mother sew and had natural talent for it. And the two of them worked together in the south room, while through the wall the trading post conducted its daily business, and occasionally Milton's voice came through asking a customer about their order. She loved those muffled conversations. She would be at her table, pins in her mouth, running a seam, and his voice would come through the wall, and she would feel the warmth of it the way you feel a fire in the next room. Winter became spring, and the road that had brought her to this life opened up again, the way it always opened up when the worst of the cold lifted. She still rode it. She still rode Buttercup north and south, still felt the wide red rock silence of the territory around her, still came home to the trading post that was now the center of her daily world. But the road felt different now, inhabited by the story she and Milton had made together, each stretch of it holding something. In April, she realized she was expecting a child. She told Milton on an evening when the sky outside the south window was going pink and gold, and the spring wind was moving through the dry grass behind the creek. She had been sitting with it for several days, allowing it to become real, because the first days of knowing something large tend to require a period of private adjustment before it becomes speakable. She told him simply, the way she said true things. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough for her to feel the beginning of uncertainty, and then he made a sound that was not precisely a word, something halfway between a breath and a word, and he put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her in a way that made her eyes fill, which she had not expected. "Are you frightened?" he said. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Enormously," he said. "And also the happiest I have been in my life." "Those can both be true," she said. "I am finding that," he said. She wrote to Clara that evening, and the letter that came back was so enthusiastic it had spatters of tea on it, as if Clara had been holding the cup while she wrote and emotion had gotten the better of her. Thomas added a postscript in his measured handwriting that said he was very glad and that he considered Milton Hayes a man worth trusting with the things that mattered. The pregnancy went well, as pregnancies in the territory went, which meant it was not without difficulty, but she was strong, and the county now had a doctor's regular circuit that brought a physician named Marsh through every 6 weeks. Dr. Marsh confirmed what she already knew and gave her the practical guidance of a man who had been practicing in frontier conditions for 20 years and understood both the risks and the resources available. She was healthy, he said. She was sensible. He expected no complications. Milton hovered in a way she found endearing and occasionally excessive, and she told him so, and he acknowledged it and continued hovering, and she found she did not actually mind as much as she suggested. She continued to work in the south room until July, when the heat made sustained sitting uncomfortable, and she was large enough that the table did not accommodate her easily. Rosa handled the orders with a growing confidence that Esther was proud of, coming to her only with the questions that genuinely required her input, which demonstrated a judgment that was better than many people's twice her age. Their son was born in November of 1883, a year after they had married, during a cold snap that brought frost to the window glass and made the creek outside almost entirely silent. Dr. Marsh was present, and Clara, who had ridden up from the ranch, the moment she received Milton's message. Milton himself paced the front room of the trading post with a controlled agitation that Clara observed through the connecting door and found entirely worthy of documentation. The baby, when he arrived, was small and loud and entirely healthy. Milton held him in the front room of the trading post, sitting in the chair he usually kept behind the counter, with the expression of a man who has been surprised by something vast. They named him James. They gave him that name deliberately and with full awareness of what it carried, the name of the man in Abilene whose story Milton had eventually stood up for and would spend his life remembering. It was Esther's suggestion. Milton accepted it with a silence that held more than silence. James Hayes grew up in the house behind the Red Mesa trading post on the north road of Calhoun Creek in the New Mexico territory. And he learned to walk between the counter and the stove and the sewing room. And he learned to talk by absorbing the vocabulary of two people who used words carefully, because they had both learned the hard way what careless words cost. Dodd was never heard from again, which was almost certainly because the legal notation from Rojo Blanco made any further claim on the water rights untenable, and because Dodd had found other corners to back other people into. Esther occasionally thought about him with a mild contempt that was not worth sustaining, and then thought about something else. The trading post grew. By 1885, Milton had expanded the building, adding 2 rooms to the main structure and bringing in a broader range of goods as the territory's infrastructure improved and the supply lines became more reliable. He hired a young man from town named Hector to help with the heavy work and deliveries, and the combination of Milton's commercial instincts and Esther's organizational precision made the post the most efficient operation on the North Road. Her sewing business grew alongside it. By 1885, she was working with 3 women, Rosa still among them, and she had established a reputation for quality that brought clients from Rojo Blanco by mail order, which was a thing she found extraordinary and gratifying in equal measure. She had a label she used on her better work, simply her initial and surname, E. Hayes. E. Hayes. She had been E. Keating for 26 years, and she was E. Hayes now, and the change still occasionally surprised her with a small fresh pleasure, the way spring always surprised her with a small fresh pleasure even after she had lived through several of them. In the spring of 1885, James was a year and a half old and beginning to develop a personality that combined Milton's observant quietness with something that was entirely his own, a kind of gleeful physical courage that expressed itself in climbing things and refusing to be discouraged by the falling off them. Milton watched him with an expression that mixed terror and pride in about equal parts. One morning in April, Esther was in the south room at her table, and she heard James in the front room saying something with great earnestness to Milton, the content of which she could not fully make out through the wall, and then Milton's voice responding, and then James's laugh, high and clear and completely certain, and she stopped what she was doing and sat with the sound of it for a moment, just the two of them on the other side of the wall, and felt something in her that was so complete and so simple that it was almost difficult to hold. She went through the door. Milton was crouched on the floor with James, showing him something in one of the books, a picture, and James was pointing at it with a fat, determined finger, and Milton was explaining what it was with the patience he brought to everything he considered worth doing. They both looked up when she came in. "What are you looking at?" she said. "Bears," James said with tremendous authority. "Bears," she agreed, crouching down beside them. She looked at the picture, and then looked at Milton above James's head, and he was looking back at her with the same look she had first seen on a Thursday morning, when a man had a gun and she had walked in anyway, the look she had spent 3 years by then accumulating more vocabulary for. She knew now what it was. It was the look a person gives you when you are the thing they did not know to look for and found anyway. "Good morning," she said, which was not what the look deserved as a response, but which made him smile. "Good morning," he said. James said something about bears again, and they both looked at him, and the morning continued around them, ordinary and irreplaceable. In the summer of 1886 she discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she was less frightened and more immediately joyful, having been through it once and knowing more of what to expect. She told Milton in the morning, before the trading post opened, in the kitchen of their house while coffee was still brewing, and this time the silence before his response was shorter, and what he said was, "I am so glad," in a voice that was straightforward and warm and left no room for ambiguity. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret, arrived in February of 1887 in a winter that was milder than the previous ones. She arrived quickly and with considerably less drama than James had, as if she had made a decision about her own efficiency early and was already implementing it. She was dark-haired and bright-eyed, and studied her new world with an expression that reminded both her parents, entirely independently, of each other. James was interested in Margaret for approximately 3 days, and then resumed his primary occupation of testing the structural limits of everything he could climb, while Margaret proceeded to develop an excellent opinion of her own needs and a very effective means of communicating them. Milton, holding both of them together in the evenings while Esther sat across the room with her work and watched, had the specific settled expression of a man who has more than he expected and knows it. By 1888, the county had grown. The railroad had come through a town 40 miles east, which changed the supply lines and the pace of everything. Milton was part of a consortium of local business owners who negotiated the freight arrangements, and Esther went to 2 of those meetings with him when the legal particulars required someone who could read contracts carefully, and afterward the consortium made it standard practice to have her review documentation. She had not set out to become the person people brought their legal documents to. She had not set out to be any particular thing in the Calhoun Creek County. She had come to stay 3 months and had stayed because the territory had gotten into her the way it gets into people who let it, vast and difficult and completely alive. One afternoon in the spring of 1888, she was in the south room when Rosa, who had been working with her for 6 years and was now functionally her partner in the business, asked her a question about pricing for a set of commissioned orders from Rojo Blanco. They discussed it for several minutes and arrived at an answer, and after Rosa went back to her own table, Esther sat for a moment in the good south light and looked at the room, the 2 tables and the bolts of fabric and the finished work hanging, and the invoices in their organized stack, and the window with the mesa visible beyond it. She had built this. From the room Milton had offered her, from the first small commissions, from the years of careful work, and the women she had trained, and the reputation that had grown from quality and reliability. She had built something real. She heard Milton in the trading post through the wall, and James somewhere outside shouting at something with the passionate conviction of a 5-year-old. And closer from the house, Margaret's voice raised in what might have been singing. She had built this, and she was in the middle of it, and it was hers. She thought about the Thursday morning with the gun in the room and the man standing with his hands raised. She thought about Dodd saying it was a private matter and saying no. She thought about the fire in October and the coyotes and his hands on hers. She thought about a road and a habit of slowing down and a cup of coffee through a window. Do you ever get lonely out here? Not since you started riding past. She was not riding past anymore. She was home. That evening after supper, after James had been put to bed with the book about bears and 2 others, and after Margaret had gone down in the good sleep of babies who have expressed all their opinions for the day, she and Milton sat on the porch of the house behind the trading post in the spring dark, listening to the creek. The stars over the New Mexico territory were the same stars that had been there when she first rode this road, vast and indifferent and completely beautiful. The kind of stars that make the smallness of a single human life feel not diminished but precious. He had his arm around her and she was leaning into his side in the easy way that several years of daily proximity creates, the way you settle into the shape of someone when you have learned all their angles. I was thinking, she said, that we should expand the south room. Into what? He said. Into 2 rooms, she said, a proper fitting room and a separate workroom. Rose's cousin has been asking about apprenticing. There is enough work for 3 people now. We can take it off the east wall, he said. There is space there. He was quiet for a moment. What else were you thinking? She smiled. He had always been able to read when she had more to say. I was thinking about James and how he asks where things come from, she said. All of the time. Where does the flower come from? Where does the river come from? And how we try to answer him honestly. We do, he said. I want him to know about Abilene eventually, she said. When he is old enough, the whole of it, not as a source of shame, but as the reason the name he has the meaning it has. Milton was quiet. She felt him breathe. Yes, he said after a moment. I have been thinking about that too. It is part of your story, she said, and your story is his. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. She felt it and felt his arm tighten slightly and settled closer. I have been thinking, he said after they had been quiet for a while, about adding a post office service. The county commissioner mentioned it when I saw him last week. The delivery circuit through here is reliable enough and they are looking for a reliable outpost. Post office service, she repeated. That would bring more traffic to the road. Yes, he said, and more work for us, but also more connection. People on the northern ranches who do not get to town easily. She thought about the northern ranches, the more isolated places where a letter from a sister was the difference between getting through a hard winter and not getting through it. She thought about what it meant to be far from people you loved and to have a reliable route for words. Yes, she said, do it. They sat on the porch until the spring cold began to come in earnest, and then they went inside to the warmth of the house that was theirs, past the shelves where their books lived together, past the quilt her mother had made on the bed they shared, into the particular light and smell of home. The south room was expanded that summer. Rose's cousin, a young woman named Valentina, began her apprenticeship in August, which brought the workroom to 3 people and the volume of work to a level that required genuine coordination. Esther managed it with the same organizational precision that had made her shop in Santa Fe successful, but she was less alone in it now, less sealed in the self-sufficiency she had built there, and the work was warmer for the difference. The post office service began in September of 1888 and brought, as Milton had anticipated, more traffic and more life to the road. Esther helped design the organizational system for the mail, which won the approval of the county commissioner and the practical gratitude of the northern ranchers, who began to rely on it with the speed of people who have been waiting for something without knowing it. James Hayes turned 5 that November, and the party they had for him at the ranch with Clara and Thomas and their own 2 children, a boy named Matthew and a girl named Lily, who were James's closest companions, was the kind of occasion that is unremarkable on the outside and irreplaceable in memory. They ate Clara's cooking, which was generous and very good, and the children ran through the autumn yard in the specific chaos of children who have no concerns beyond the present moment, and the adults sat at the table in the warm kitchen and talked about the county and the coming winter and the plans they each had for the spring. Milton and Thomas talked, and Esther and Clara talked, and occasionally the 2 conversations merged and then separated again. And outside the children shouted at each other with great intensity about something involving a stick, and the kitchen was warm and the food was good, and the light was the particular gold of late autumn afternoon in the territory. Esther watched Milton across the table, talking to Thomas with his elbows on Clara's good tablecloth in the way she had told him 12 times not to do. And she thought about the road and the first morning and the cup of coffee through the window and the fire in October and the deed with the invalid statutes and a man standing with his hands raised and a woman walking through a door. She thought about all of the moments that had led here, to this kitchen table, to this life, to these people, and the thought had the particular quality that lives which are genuinely happy produce in the people living them, a kind of forward-looking, backward-looking both at once, a gratitude so solid it does not need to be performed. Clara caught her eye across the table and smiled. Esther smiled back. Outside, James's voice rose above the others and then was answered by Matthew's, and then they were all laughing, all the children, the clean, bright sound of it carrying through the glass and into the kitchen. Milton looked over at the sound of it and then looked at Esther, and in the brief crossing of that look was everything it had been for 6 years, the road and the fire and the document in his coat pocket and the question and the answer, the vows and the morning with the book about bears and the porch in the spring dark. She held his gaze for a moment. He smiled. She smiled back. Outside, the children were still laughing. The Red Rock country of the New Mexico Territory stretched in every direction under a sky that had the particular deep blue of late autumn, and the road ran north and south through it, the way roads do in country like that, straight where it can be straight and honest about where it cannot, carrying the traffic of ordinary lives between the places where those lives happen. The road had carried Esther Keating north on a chestnut mare for 6 weeks in the autumn of 1882, had carried her back and forth until the riding past became stopping, and the stopping became home, and the home had become a house and a business and a family and a life larger and warmer than the one she had left behind. She would ride that road for many years more, sometimes with Milton beside her and sometimes alone, and sometimes with James bouncing on a saddle in front of her, and eventually with Margaret doing the same. And the road would know her the way roads know the people who commit to them, each hoofprint and wagon wheel and footstep adding to the conversation. And every time she rode it, she would pass the trading post and know she was home, and the knowing would be simple and permanent and entirely true. Not since you started riding past. She had not stopped riding past. She had ridden all the way in.